Hello, Faith family. I'm Cheryl. I'm one of the pastoral staff for worship and music here in Faith Methodist Church. And it's a great pleasure to bring to you today's midweek devotion, which is on Ezekiel 38. Now, Ezekiel 38 is a very interesting passage because even until now, Bible scholars cannot agree as to whether it had happened before or it will happen in the end times, because it refers to characters that are non-existent when Ezekiel was alive and are made mentioned in Revelations. So Ezekiel 38 is a prophecy about a nation's leader called Gog. And Gog is led out of his country, and during his travels with his army, he gains the alliance of countries like Persia, Gomer, and Cush. He then devises a scheme to invade Israel with his allies. Now, Israel in this passage is described as a peace-loving nation. Having just recovered their land from war, the Israelites have returned and are safe and experiencing economic prosperity, as seen in the description of it being rich in livestock and goods, living at the center of the land. Yet, it also describes Israel as a nation that does not have a visible defense system. It's a nation of unwalled villages and people living without walls, without gates and bars. I don't know about you, but if I were the leader of Israel upon returning back to my homeland after experiencing diaspora, being evicted and being invaded multiple times, I would invest in a very good military system, military defense, build up my army, tell the whole world, hey, don't mess with us now. And in the same vein, in our everyday lives, doesn't that happen also? Many of us experience hurt and pain, be it from someone, or maybe you accidentally fall down, you tripped into the drain, and then you tell yourself, hey, I'm not going to trip into that drain ever again. So I'm going to defend myself by staying away, or I build up that wall to the person who has hurt me by keeping an emotional distance from them. Yet, the Israelites, despite being invaded and forcefully evicted from their homeland before, chose not to wall up their villages or invest in some fencing or even build up their defense system. And why is this the case? And this brings me to the first and very most important point that we can learn from this prophecy. We must be aware and willing to accept our vulnerability. I would like to draw a parallel to what Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 12, which reads, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I will delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So counterintuitive, isn't it? To be boastful of our weakness. And Paul says that he delights in his weakness, not even just content with, accept, this is my lot. But he delights in it. Because earlier in 2 Corinthians 12, he says that he's reminded that God's power is made perfect in weakness. And just to be clear, when we are talking about weakness here, we're not talking about being a pushover or lacking physical or personal strength. In this case, weakness refers to our human limitations, our human struggles. Paul finds delight in his limitations because he knows that whatever that he has experienced or has been able to do is truly from the power of God that goes beyond his limitations. Now, returning to the Israelites, in their vulnerability of having no walls or fences, they are publicly showing that their trust is not in their military strength, but in the God they worship. And because they are not relying on their strength to defend themselves, God's glory and power can and will be shown mightily through miraculous means. Now, it's hard to admit that we have limitations. And I would say for myself that I would try my very best to take things into my own hands and try to solve the problem and rely on my own strength and my own intellect. But then this brings us to our second point. Trust that God is in control. Now, one thing interesting to note is that at the beginning of Ezekiel 38, we read that Gog is actually led out of his country by God himself. This can be seen in verse 4 that reads, I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaw, and bring you out with your whole army. Now, God is not a reactionary God. He did not go, oh no, he's invading, what do I do? He's not one who plays by ears and scrambles at the last minute to find all the resources that he can get to defend Israel. Throughout the whole passage, we can see that God had already laid out the plans of not just Gog's plans, but also his own when Gog decides to invade Israel. God knows all the countries that ally with Gog, and also the ones who are tempted by the spoils of the invasion. He even clearly tells Gog in verse 17, you are the one I spoke of in former days by my servants, the prophets of Israel. At that time, they prophesied for years that I would bring you against them. God is an all-knowing God. And just how God knows about this invasion, he too knows about all the struggles and difficulties that we go through, the storms that we have to weather. God knows where you are, and he will deliver you. And how exactly will God deliver? Now, in this passage, God used the planned invasion of Israel to stage a grand declaration of his power and might. He declares that he will cause a great earthquake that causes all living creatures to quake in his presence, mountains to fall, walls to crumble. And there's this depictions of natural disasters like hail and burning sulfur. But most importantly, God shows his undeniable might to the sight of many nations. And this brings me to my very last point. God will deliver you in the most miraculous of ways. Now, it might seem so unrealistic to think about burning sulfur, mountains crumbling, but essentially this boils down to the fact that God will defend Israel in such a way that is so amazing, so reality-bending that people cannot chalk it up to human might and endeavor, but solely on the power of God. Some of us have experienced that divine intervention, that divine deliverance, perhaps through the curing of or the healing of an incurable disease. For others, it might not be so obvious. But looking back after a trial or a storm, a difficult season, we come to realize that the only way that we could have weathered that whole season was through the strength and power of God that was shown when we acknowledge before him our weakness and show him our most vulnerable state and surrender to his plans. Now, church, in what way will you stay vulnerable to God's divine ways? I pray that you will ask God to shine that light onto any areas that we have subconsciously built up a wall, that we ask God to tear it down, and we trust in a God who holds everything in his hands. God bless.